Welcome to History 2020. My name is Dr. Sawyer, and I'll be your professor for today. What have we made it through in this class? The end of the Civil War. We've made it through 1893 financial panic. We've made it through the Great Depression. We've made it through World War II. We made it through a lot. So let's just keep going. And also, in comparison to World War I and World War II, you're a punk, coronavirus, so what's up? All right, that's right. I'm talking trash. Online, challenge issued. All right, World War II versus coronavirus. Fight. Okay, can't do that. Unfortunately, I'm just a historian, not a wizard. Last time we talked about the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement. One of the important things there that I wanted you all to get was that the anti-war movement is far more complex than simply hippies. There's what happened, and then there's our memory as a country. And our memory sometimes does not reflect what happened. Actually, pretty frequently, but you know. Something we didn't get to last time was the Supreme Court. And I just wanted to mention this here because it's really important how the Supreme Court changes in this time period. You start seeing the Supreme Court begin to uphold more individual rights. And two big cases in these years that go along with the theme of civil rights and individual rights. In 1966, you have the decision of Miranda versus Arizona. This is, the Miranda rights. When people are arrested, the idea that, someone has to say, you have the right to remain silent. When I was a kid, I used to watch those cop shows. I'd always hear him say, you have the right to remain silent, anything you say. I used to think that was kind of like being a punk, being like, hey, you got the right to shut up. That's, it kind of sounded like that to me. But in fact, it's the police asserting your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent to avoid self-incrimination. And, I've told you in the past that the reason, or one big reason you should know your rights is because people don't tell you your rights when they're taking them away from you. Except for when the Supreme Court says that you have to. So now, it's to make people aware you don't have to say anything. But if you do, we're going to use it. That's what it's about. You also have a big case, which this one usually blows people's mind. It's called Loving versus Virginia. And in this Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court rules that states cannot have laws banning interracial marriage. That's right. Until 1967, there were several states in the United States in which it was illegal to marry someone of a different race. I don't know. Sometimes people don't believe that one. And I'm like, yeah, that's right. It's amazing how quickly the world can change. Last lecture, we left off with this magnificent map of the 1972 election. Nixon just crushing it. Winning every state, really, except for Massachusetts. Even Delaware, guys. Even Delaware voted for Nixon. Delaware? Really? Delaware? You also may notice something here, that if you look, one of the other districts that voted against him was D.C. You see this popping up here? That's because the 23rd Amendment had been passed, which gave 3 electoral votes to Washington, D.C. So that's a change. And then you see Nixon, aside from that, just sweeping the country. And last time, remember, we ended off like, man, if you're walking into this kind of a victory here, this kind of a huge victory, surely you're not really that worried about what's going on, So let's just talk about what made Nixon so popular. We focus so much on presidents that sometimes we forget really important aspects of history. Like, for example, here is a chart of basically it's the Senate's on the bottom, the House is on the top. Which party controlled the branches of Congress? You can see that in the Senate, they dominated for all but 4 years from the 1930s up until the 1990s. In the House, you can see the same 4 years in the 1940s and 50s. They controlled the House, but then in the 1990s, if you guys are familiar with Newt Gingrich, there is a push under Clinton where for the first time in a long time, the Republicans take control of the House. But overall, these years, and notice this, the entire Nixon presidency, Nixon is working with a Democratic Congress. It's a different Democratic Congress because it includes the Southern Democrats, who are very receptive and supportive of Nixon's policies. They've started splitting. Remember, Strom Thurmond, Jesse Helms is going to split away. A lot of the old Southern Democrats are going to become Republicans. But at this point in time, still, if you caucus with the Democrats, that party has control. So just to put that in context. So what made Nixon so popular that he won like this? Well, in foreign policy, Nixon, as you guys, again, know from the history documentary Forrest Gump, opened relations with China. He also really worked to establish better relations with the Soviet Union. A lot of his foreign policy comes from a guy named Henry Kissinger, who is still alive. I mean, for goodness sakes, that guy is ancient. But it's all under this guy's, it's all under this this plan of what we call realpolitik. Basically, a lot less ideology in terms of, capitalist versus communism, and more like what can we get out of this situation, right? So one of the pushes to open up China is to basically open up a wedge inside the communist camp, right? Remember, I told you for a long time American politicians had seen communism as all the same thing, and that to Nixon's credit and his foreign policy establishment credit, they're the first ones who really take a hold of what's happening, which is a split between the Soviets and China, which has been going on for a while. So that's really important. And then they negotiate arms limitations with the Soviet Union. So there's a lot of progress there. Again, wish we had more time to get into it. Another thing that Nixon does that is more like his predecessors is he relies on our covert ops, on our intelligence services for a lot of foreign policy goals. One of the big ones is in 1973, on September 11th, 1973, I should add. There's a coup in Chile in which the Democratic president is overthrown, and a guy named Augusto Pinochet, a brutal dictator, is put in, then comes to power. The CIA had a hand in that, and that's been a tragedy. One of the interesting things is that how absolutely unabashedly aggressive the Pinochet regime is. They literally put a bomb in Washington, D.C., a few blocks from the White House, to kill one of the previous foreign ministers of the pre-coup regime. And it mid-1970s just went off. And so, yeah, it's a regime. People were dragged into the stadium, and there were mass killings. To this day, still, some people are gone, just disappeared. So that, in many ways, is a continuation, unfortunately. But back home, Nixon doesn't do a whole lot to shake up the programs of the Democrats, the social programs. And of course, Congress remains controlled by Democrats, so there's only so much the executive can do, although it is more than you might expect. If you look at the federal agencies that are established under Nixon, this might surprise you. Now remember, Nixon's a Republican. But some people call, and this is fascinating, some people call Nixon the last truly liberal American president. And what I think they mean by that, and it's a debate, right? And there's some tongue-in-cheek, kind of turn on that, is that Nixon is really the last president that seems to have faith that the government can help improve people's lives. In the way that you have, in the mid-20th century. You have the creation of many federal agencies. OSHA, you guys know OSHA? You guys ever heard of OSHA, the Occupational Safe and Healthy Administration, the ones that make you put on steel-toe boots when you go to work, or don't if they're not there? It's established to ensure the workplace safety. Nixon's administration is also very progressive on environmental issues. If you look at it, the EPA is established in December of 1970. Nixon signs that into law happily. The Clean Air Act in December of 1970. Later on, the Endangered Species Act of December 1973. These are programs that Nixon picks up and runs with. And so these issues, along with Nixon's continuation of law and order, his promise, and his initial push to wind down U.S. involvement in Vietnam is make people pretty happy. Also, side note, can't get into it. The guy he runs against in 1972, George McGovern, is the Dems go all in on like the most liberal policies, and that is rejected largely by the public. I should also add that in March of 1971, Congress ratifies the 26th Amendment, and then that July it is passed by the states. This ensures that all people 18 and up shall have the right to vote, all citizens. Why in 1971 might this become a hot button issue? Why would people be talking about this?
War in Vietnam.
Yeah, because the draft age is 18. And there is a certain irony in sending 18-year-olds abroad to fight in a war when they have no say-so whatsoever in electing the people who make that decision for them. So that's one of the reasons why you see this. By the way, that's the 26th. There's one more amendment between then and now. We are in a real dry spell for constitutional amendments, which reflects, I think, a lot of our attitude towards government, but don't have time for that. So, you got this. I say you got this a lot. I noticed that when I'm editing my lecture. So you got this? Well, yeah, obviously you've got this. Let's move on. Let's not waste any more time with this rhetoric. Nixon's handling the Vietnam War is interesting because he begins a slow withdrawal of U.S. troops. You guys may recall his secret plan. You guys remember Nixon had a secret plan? Nixon was like, had a secret plan to get us out of Vietnam. He wouldn't tell anybody, but then later on it was kind of like his secret plan was to stop Vietnam from signing, South Vietnam from signing a peace agreement. You got that in the last lecture. One of the things that Nixon hopes is that better relations with the USSR will help end the war, that they'll essentially kind of get involved. But as a part of this, Nixon expands the war into Southeast Asia. He orders troops into Cambodia in 1970. He orders troops into Cambodia in 1970 and continues strikes to exert pressure on the North. The protests continue. May 4th, 1970, there is a protest at Kent State University in Ohio. The National Guard is called out. It is a tragic situation because people want to make heroes or martyrs or monsters out of the people involved. I think if you go back and read it, it's tragic for everyone because the National Guard troops who come out there, they're scarred by it. The students are scarred by it. The nation is scarred by it. It just really hits people hard. It's like, didn't we elect the guy that was supposed to end these things? You also have, and I don't have time to really get into all of this. That's everything, by the way. I don't know why I even bother saying that. That's just a blanket statement. I don't have time to get into everything, and I wish I did. So the anti-war movement continues to make progress, and in fact, there's a famous speech by the group, in this group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War. One of their leaders, a guy named John Kerry, who you might have heard of, who ran for president in 2004 and lost, longtime senator, Secretary of State, the second one under Obama, a guy who's still very prominent. People know him today, although less so, I guess. But he goes in. This guy was a Vietnam veteran, and he went in and gave a speech to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about what he had seen. And a lot of the opposition to the war and a lot of the reason why it continues to be successful is because young men who come back from this war share their stories and tell people what went on. And again, this dichotomy, like it was hippies versus soldiers. A lot of the most compelling testimony and the most compelling evidence that comes to help push public opinion over the edge comes from veterans. And that matters. So finally, January 27th, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords end this war. 2 months later, it takes them 2 months for the U.S. to takes less than 2 months for the U.S. to begin withdrawing soldiers. And shortly after the last soldiers leave, in April of 1975, North Vietnam captures Saigon, unifies the country under Northern leadership. The death tolls here, and these are estimated because it's hard to get all exact numbers. 58,000 Americans died in this war. Many times over more, scarred by their experiences there, left with marks on them, emotionally, psychologically. And 3 to 4 million Vietnamese die in this war. Civilians, a lot of them. And you could imagine that this is when you look back on it, and you look back at the time, energy, the lives, the souls that were invested in this war, and you see that in the end, what was the outcome? It leaves the United States a bit doubtful, and Americans a bit doubtful about their role in the world in a way that they haven't really questioned prior to this since the end of World War II. This lecture brought to you by Dan Quayle. Dan Quayle, that guy was seriously vice president? All right, cool. Now let's move on. Now, Nixon, again, wildly popular president in 1972 when he runs for re-election, but here's the thing. Nixon, paranoid. Actually, I believe it might have been Kissinger who coined the phrase, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. Which is quite a line. So here's the thing. Nixon, corrupt as hell. I mean, I don't even know how better way to say this. While on the outside of it, people support Nixon. And Nixon, again, I'll say it again. I do believe that Nixon really cared about this country. I think he loved America, just in a really not okay way. Like in a why don't you love me back the same way? Like in a really kind of like the guy who's like always like, let me see your phone. Like that kind of a love, not a healthy relationship, but you never question whether or not he loves you. Maybe it's not love, but you feel deeply. So in 1971, when the New York Times begins publishing the top secret government study of the Vietnam War that I mentioned in the last lecture, the Pentagon Papers, Nixon's like, let's get him. Let's punish this guy. Now, most of the evidence that came out was not from Nixon's administration, but it was like a slight to him. So he forms a group called the Plumbers. You guys know why you need plumbers? Why do you call a plumber, guys? Why do you call it?
Unclog your toilet.
Well, unclog your toilet. That's a different issue. But Isaac, you're right. You call a plumber because you got leaks you want to fix. So he forms this group of folks. And their first operation is they target Daniel Ellsberg, the guy I told you that essentially slipped these papers to the New York Times. And they sneak into his psychologist's office to steal the papers his psychologist has on him, to possibly find some deep secret or something really embarrassing to leak to the press, to destroy this guy's reputation and to just kind of make his life harder. No goals aside from that. I mean, I guess you intimidate anybody else from doing it. But it's not like if we find out what's in here, we can figure out who inside the government's leaking it. He was the guy who got the information out. This is mean-spirited. Or as they'd say back where I'm from, that's just spot work right there. He also, with the help of his counsel, John Dean, compiles an enemies list. An enemies list. Nixon has an enemies list. That kid in middle school that's like, I'm going to get you. I'm going to get you. You guys seen Billy Madison? Nixon has like an enemies list. All right. This is nuts. And this is a memorandum here that was leaked, that came out later on. And here you go. This is a cover memo by John Dean to the two people inside of the Nixon administration. Headline, Dealing with Our Political Enemies. There you go. This memorandum addresses the matter of how we can maximize the fact that our incumbency in dealing with persons known to be active in their operation to our administration. Stated a bit more bluntly, how we can use the available federal machinery to screw our political enemies. This is an official memorandum. Those were not words that I made up to summarize it. That's what they said. After reviewing this matter with a number of persons possessed of expertise in the field, I've concluded that we do not need elaborate mechanism or game plan. Rather, we need a good project coordinator and full support for the project. In brief, the system would work as follows. Key members of the staff, such as Colston, Dent, Flankin, and Pat Buchanan, should be requested to inform us as to who they feel we should be giving a hard time. Again, a nice turn of words there. The project coordinator should then determine what sorts of dealings these individuals have with the federal government and how we can best screw them. For example, grant availability, federal contracts, litigation, prosecution, etc. The project coordinator should then have access to the full support of the top officials of the agency or department in proceeding to deal with the individual. And they do this. One of the big ways they do it is that Nixon orders the IRS to target his enemies and begin auditing them. He later on, during the Watergate investigation, is going to use the CIA to shut down the FBI investigation. So he's essentially using one intelligence organization to undermine the other one. This is intense. And you guys are like, wow, an enemies list, huh? Yeah, 500 people on that enemies list. 500 people. How many enemies do you guys have? I've got thousands. I mean, he's only got 500. That's pretty, I'm just kidding. 500 is a lot of enemies. So you guys are like, man, who was it? Well, here's some examples from the list. Joe Namath, Jets quarterback, enemy. Paul Newman, actor Paul Newman. You guys ever heard of Paul Newman? Cool hand Luke. Sorry, you guys are young. You guys ever heard of Paul Newman? Yeah. Enemy. Also, you guys ready for this? Bill Cosby. So sometimes, maybe he knows something that we don't know is all I'm saying. Turns out an enemy to a lot of all that's decent. So in 1972, Nixon's he's been pulling this off and working with these plumbers. 1972, in the lead up, this is June, in the lead up to the 1972 election, the one, again, that he destroys on. It's not even close. Still a little bit paranoid. Nixon's folks are caught stealing information from the Democratic National Convention at the Watergate Hotel. And Nixon's like, I had no clue that was going on. Well, it turns out that it gets even better than this. Because in a totally unrelated issue, in October of 1973, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, he resigns after accusations that he had accepted bribes as the governor of Maryland. Maryland, your governors. I'm going to cut this out, but anyway. After this, Gerald Ford replaces Spiro Agnew as vice president. And Nixon's like, I didn't do this. So we'll open up an investigation into it, Oh, yeah, I'm cool with that. But then, on October 20th, 1973, Nixon orders the Justice Department to fire the special investigator Archibald Cox, the guy who is conducting the investigation. So his Justice Department head resigns, and essentially he just fires everyone in the Justice Department till he finds someone who will follow that order and follow the special investigation, right? Because, he fires everyone until he gets to someone who will fire the investigator. The other people are like, that would be a little unethical. And finally, he gets his guy. Nixon's slick. He does this on Saturday night. It's a time when no one's really up and watching TV, paying attention. The next day's Sunday. People aren't really following it in the same way. And after all these people suddenly depart, but it wasn't Nixon that fired the investigator. Come on. It was someone in the Justice Department. but people noticed. In the end, the Attorney General, John Mitchell, and 2 White House aides are convicted of obstructing justice. And Nixon resigns. During this investigation, Nixon is pretty slick. There are 3 investigations actually going down. It's pretty complicated. So you have the special investigator through the Justice Department. You also have a Senate investigation going on and a House investigation going on. The House investigation is the one that works. It's the most effective. The reason that the House investigation is so it's able to get more done is because those who oversee it decide they're not going to make this a partisan thing. The other folks, and for a lot of people, they don't like Nixon. They don't like what he's done in Vietnam. They don't like his politics. And a lot of people, when it comes down to these issues of what Watergate, when it comes down to these issues of what did Nixon do that was illegal in regards to this Watergate situation and his actual illegal activities inside the White House, a lot of people bundle that in and they want to say, yeah, he did this. But in the House, they know better and they stick to the terms of the actual investigation. They don't make this about destroying Nixon as a person. They try to focus on, did he do these things? Because if he did, this is very bad. And that's one of the reasons they're so effective. The turning point in Watergate, and this is awesome, the turning point is when the investigators find out about Nixon's taping system. Have you guys watched the Nixon by Nixon documentary yet? Who here's watched that documentary? Yeah. Those tapes all come out as a part of this investigation. People didn't know about that at first, but it comes out in the investigation. And in the end, Nixon is like, yeah, I don't think we have those. And they're like, no, we know you have them. He's like, oh, yeah, okay, but we don't really have the tapes. And they're like, yes, you do. And he's like, okay, but you can't have them. They're mine. It's executive privilege. And they're like, actually, no, we're investigating you and you don't get to just do that. And he's like, okay, fine, I'll give them to you. And then he gives portions of them that are dubs. Essentially, like back in the days of tape, what you could do is like record a portion and then stop, fast forward through another portion that you don't want people to hear, and then just record again. So he's like, yeah, you guys can have some copies. And they're like, it's weird because there are portions missing from these copies that were at the exact same time that we accused you of doing things. And he's like, I think my secretary recorded over that. In the end, he has to turn over the originals. And if you read Tim Naftali's chapter in the new impeachment book by Jeff Ingham, he does a really good job of depicting that story through the lens of the House. And that moment where Nixon finally, he's had his defenders, they're like, no, he didn't do these things. Nixon calls them into the White House and is like, all right, so gonna have to release these tapes. And I was just wondering, you guys have been great. By the way, you guys have been awesome friends. Did I tell you I love you guys? I know it's not really like me, but you guys are so great. I just want to know how much this means to me. Anyway, I'm just going to play something for you guys. And now y'all listen to it and you tell me what you think, okay? Just a little something that's going to come out. And he plays those recordings of him saying and doing all the things that he said he hadn't done. And even his most staunch supporters are like, we're out of here. You're a monster. And that's when Nixon's like, okay, I think I know how the general public's going to respond. And he's like, you can't fire me. I quit. So he avoids actually being impeached, but he does leave office. When he leaves, Ford comes in. Gerald Ford. You guys know Gerald Ford? Not many people know Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford had, just a year before this, he had been, in the House of Representatives from Michigan, just chilling. And then, boom, he's vice president, demotion. And then, boom, he's the president. This guy was never elected to the executive. Never. And now he's the president. Ford, again, caveat, don't have much time to get into him. I will tell my favorite story about him, though. When he went to China, the Chinese government decided they were going to greet him and try to make friends with him, right? So they knew this guy. Gerald Ford played football at University of Michigan. So the Chinese decided, we're going to get the fight song for University of Michigan. And when this guy gets off the plane, we're going to have it playing. We're going to have the Chinese national band playing the fight song of University of Michigan. And this guy's going to love us. Surprise, hey. But they messed up and they got the sheet music to the Michigan State fight song. So when this guy comes walking off of the plane for his first visit to China, the national band is playing his rival's song. It's great. Oh, China, thank you for that. I know you didn't mean to, but go green. Ford, boom. Quick run, right? Into 73. He's the minority leader. All of a sudden, he's the president. He comes in and he tells Americans, our long national nightmare is over. And that's intense. But also, as you're going to see, he might be wrong about that. He also, shortly after taking office, about a month later, he pardons Nixon. He's like, hey, I'm pardoning Nixon for any crimes he committed or may have committed. Basically, all charges are dropped. A lot of people hated him for that. You're just going to let this guy who we know did all these things, all these corrupt things, get away with it? I might be in the minority here when I say this, but sometimes it's better to move on. Maybe not in this case, but I think if you imagine the image of the United States putting a president on trial, in the middle of all this turmoil, I think it's just, I don't know, just a thought. Also, maybe he deserved more because this dude just slides off. It's hard. But I think that what the hell, Nixon deserved to get punished is the way most people think about it. But in the context, I think that, and in fact, historians have more recently been contemplating whether or not Ford made a good decision. Like maybe he did. So anyway, just some thoughts. There's Gerald Ford over there. By the way, I usually have a great, when I have more time, I play a clip from SNL. It's an opening scene from the first season where Chevy Chase plays Gerald Ford. I can't put it in this video. There are a couple of things I can't put in this video because I know it will get pulled from YouTube immediately, and ripping SNL, which has historically been pretty jealous of their footage, is one of them. But if you go look it up, it's the one where he's comes in. It's the one where he falls. That's all of his openings. But it's season 1 opener for Gerald Ford, and check that out later on because it's so funny. It's just a bad Gerald Ford impression, but it gets at the way people thought about Ford. Shortly after this, Congress opens. Shortly after this, the Senate opens what's called the Church Committee. It is an investigation of the activities of the executive. Because there's one thing that happens during Watergate and the investigations, it's that Congress discovers just how much the executive has been doing without telling anybody else about it. This is where a lot of this information we now know, things about the FBI spying on citizens, right? Things about the, COINTELPRO, a lot of investigation of citizens, the anti-war movement, investigation of having the security services investigate other politicians. That's where the Watergate investigation is where a lot of this comes up for the first time. So there's this thorough investigation in 76, and it just dumps this information out there. This is where the public discovers a lot of the things that we now know, including Alan Dully's plan to use the Sicilian mafia to assassinate Fidel Castro. The U.S. involvement in the coups abroad. Remember, and this is something to keep straight, the CIA, the FBI, these are executive offices. That means that the president does not have to just keep Congress up on what's going on unless Congress is very diligent about it. And you may recall that the executive has been going stronger and stronger in these years. It's not even a partisan thing. Remember the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, August 1964, when Congress was like, "You do the war, do the war, do the war, Johnson. You got this. Just whatever you need." And this shocks people. In response to this, Gerald Ford signs Executive Order 11905, which reforms the U.S. intelligence and this is the best part. This is the best part. It bans U.S. sanctioned plans to kill foreign leaders. You had to write that down? Like, you had to be like, all right, guys, I know this is crazy, and I know it's going to be hard to get this through Congress, so I'm just going to, executive order. All right, guys, all executive agencies, just don't kill any foreign leaders, okay? I feel like even saying that is just, it's kind of like, wow, what a problem. All this comes together to really bring Americans' faith in government to just rubble. Remember that during World War II, the United States the population had become closer to the federal government. It had become more a part of their lives. And now here you are, you're looking at 1976, looking at this church report. Last two presidents you've had, not Ford, but Nixon, Johnson. It's not a partisan thing. Johnson clearly lied to the public, or at least misinformed them about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and then lied to them about the progress of the war. Nixon then comes into office and uses the executive government. Sorry. Use more water. I'm squeaking it up over here. Nixon then comes in on a promise to get us out of Vietnam, to improve foreign relations, and it turns out he's been abusing his executive power. And all this comes in a greater context that is, it's not like things are all sunny and everybody's doing great and they're like, oh, well, the federal government. The 1970s is a hard decade. If you guys remember, we talked about how in the 1950s and in the post-World War II era, how Americans have begun moving to suburbs. The construction of the interstate had led to a shift in the city. Well, cities are left behind. And when they leave, they still have the same infrastructure. They still have to maintain the same things, but they lose massive amounts of tax revenue. On top of that, decades of just dumping materials into rivers, there's no environmental regulations, had made cities, all this made cities really rough places to live. In 1969, the Cuyahoga River, main river that runs, in 1969, the Cuyahoga River, the river that runs right through the city of Cleveland, catches on fire.
Again?
Yes, that's right. Again. It had caught on fire several times. I honestly don't even know what you do if a river catches on fire. What do you put it out with? You're like, it's water that's on fire. Do you get water? Are you in a boat? I don't know how you put out a river that's on fire. It seems like a bit of a challenge that you've probably never come into if you're a firefighter, honestly. Except for if you're in Cleveland in 69 where you're like, again, all right, let's get the baking powder out. I don't know how you do it. Do you guys know Randy Newman, the guy who wrote the songs for Toy Story? That's how much the Cuyahoga River caught on fire, was that Randy Newman was like, I'm writing songs about LA, I'm writing songs about America, and was like, you know what? I'm also going to write a song about the Cuyahoga River catching on fire, because that's just something that happens and is part of our nation. So check out the Randy Newman song for those of you guys who are on YouTube and not here live with us. Pollution, this is one of the reasons that the EPA is passed. This is one of the reasons that the federal government takes up the environmental issue. And I think that Americans are kind of disregarding the environment in the 21st century Again, same way that people are like, yeah, we don't need vaccinations. We are sometimes victims of our own incredible success with solving some of the great plagues of humanity. And we take them for granted and we're like, we don't need those anymore. Yeah, just think about that. Go back and look at why we passed the environmental regulations in the first place and ask yourself, would Nashville be better if the Cumberland River were on fire? Now, there's pros and cons to that, right? There's pros and cons to having a river on fire. I'm just saying. But the trouble of cities and what to do about them, that adds to this growing crisis, the sense of crisis. In the 1970s, there's a huge economic downturn. We go off the gold standard, which allows the currency to float. Fiat currency, which is currency that's not based upon a hard metal. Basically, it's subject to supply and demand, goes into effect. This pushes in massive inflation. Adding to this, in October of 1973, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, passes an oil embargo, partially in response to U.S. foreign policy, which means that in a period of 5 months, oil prices go up 4 times. And not just that, there are shortages. People can't get gasoline. They implement programs where you can only go get a certain amount of gas on the days when you have even or odd a number in your license plate. This is America. This is the land of automobiles, gigantic automobiles and cheap gas. And the U.S. oil supplies getting a little bit lower. If you want to know what the oil crisis does to America, here's a 1969 Ford Mustang, one of America's great sports cars, okay? Here's what happens in the 1970s. Does that help you see? America in 69 turns into America in 74. You know the only sadder thing than what happened to the Ford Mustang? The only sadder thing is that my parents had a Mustang too. They bought it new. They're part of the problem. They bought a brand new Mustang too. So that's by the way, there's no way my parents are going to watch this, but if you are, hey, I love you. In 76, Jimmy Carter wins the Democratic nomination. Came out of nowhere. Jimmy Carter, the governor of Georgia, got a Southern accent, even more so. A born-again Christian. You guys, nobody knew what that was outside of the South. People were like, is that a cult? Is that like what's going on with that? To us in the South, like, we know what that means. But people were like, what is up with this guy? A born-again Christian, like, what's that? Carter is a Democrat. He's a Southern Democrat, but he's part of kind of a newer generation of them. Well, not a newer generation, but a newer mindset. He's on the side of civil rights and things like that, for example. He wouldn't get applauded for by that guy at the inauguration for George Wallace. That's for sure. That guy would not like him. So the Republicans nominate Ford, which is interesting. Ronald Reagan almost beats Ford in the primary in 76. I mean, a sitting president almost gets primaried by Reagan. It's nuts. You can see that Reagan's on the rise at that point. Carter narrowly wins. Sometimes people say that you get the leadership you deserve, not the leadership you want. But I don't think we deserve Jimmy Carter. I think Jimmy Carter might have been too good for us. I think Jimmy Carter, I don't know. Carter falls in an interesting category. Because what's about to happen is that you're going to see the rise of the evangelical movement in the United States with like Jerry Falwell and Focus on the Family and this whole culturally conservative movement. That alliance, you'd think, would be like, oh, good, we've got a born-again Christian in the White House. This is what we want. They don't support him. They support Reagan. They support a guy with like no clear history of having any affiliation with Christianity. I mean, not evident. A guy who was divorced, Not of, by the way, not of his own choice. I am not criticizing Reagan here. I'm simply putting him in the context of what the movement, this conservative movement itself says. And all of this taken together, it's one of the great questions I think that we're learning more and more about is like, why would the modern evangelical movement become a force in politics and not support the evangelical president and go with the California actor, which I'm putting that simply. Reagan had far more experience than just that. So Carter wins. And in his presidency, he's an outsider. The Democratic Party did not want him there. I don't know if you've noticed recently, but the Democratic Party has a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to anyone but insiders winning. They actually, after Carter wins, they changed the way that their primary structure works to give more power to the inside of the party to keep people like Carter from winning again. But while he's there, you have continued economic crisis, another oil shortage. Carter, how do I put this? There's what you want to hear in life, and there's what you need to hear in life. And I feel like Carter told Americans what they needed to hear. And it was not what they wanted to hear. One of the themes that I've been talking about in this class is the post-World War II moment. The convergence of forces that make the United States this incredible place to live, thrust it into a world leadership role, create economic prosperity. And if you recall, one of the things that I told you is the biggest reason for that is World War II. The United States has over half the world's industrial capacity. We're unscathed by the war in terms of infrastructure, except for in our periphery. But the key 48 states are intact. It thrusts us into power. But like all things that are created by events and moments, they have to end. But I think during the Cold War, we told ourselves that we were special. We told ourselves that we were different. We told ourselves that we were the future. One of the reasons we hated the Soviet Union so much was they dared to say they were the future. So, hard for us to accept that. We didn't like it. And in the end, we made it longer. But we like to think that we're special. We like to think, no. We are the greatest country in the world. We like to, instead of that being a truth statement that sometimes we try to live up to, it's like a slogan. The greatest country in the world. But if all the things that happened to you weren't just because you're the greatest country in the world, if all the things that happened to you weren't just because there's some kind of a divine meaning for your country to fulfill a mission, if all of the big causes for you rising into that position aren't analyzed, they're just assumed, the problem is that when the moment begins to fade, you don't ask what happened so much as you ask, who did this to us? Whose fault is this? I mean, we're just supposed to be great, so if we're not, it's got to be somebody to blame. And that's why when I'm leaving you on this moment here in the class, 1980, with this election, like breaking a ride, like your kid's starting to walk down the stairs and you being panicked. Jimmy Carter told Americans it can't go on forever. He dared to do it. He told Americans, look, you know what? Energy can't go on forever. Jimmy Carter dared to tell Americans what they didn't want to hear. He told them this can't go on forever. He said, and he actually dared to say, instead of burning energy, instead of increasing the heat in your house, put on a sweater. And this guy was crucified. My take is that American politicians learned a lot from that election. Don't tell America that that moment's over. Don't tell them it's dead. That upsets them. I think the Democratic Party locked into if we think about phases of grief, the Democratic Party locked into a denial phase that anything's changed. And the Republicans moved into an anger phase. And I think that might be where we are right now. And if you want to, this is my take. You can debate this. This isn't me telling you this as your professor. You don't have to memorize this, but this is my thought on it. That if you want to understand why the Republican Party has done so much better than the Democratic Party, just understand that they're advanced more in the stages of grief. But that if you actually want to solve the problem, maybe it's time to move on to acceptance and looking at everything that's left. And I think I've never seen a greater manifestation of this than the 2016 election. An election where you had two major party candidates, one of which acted like everything was fine, and another one that was just raging, angry, and pointing fingers. Carter tried to warn us. We didn't like it. Felt like we're being lectured to. And if there's one thing you know from America, it's we don't want experts lecturing at us. Come on. So let's just do a rundown of the 1970s, okay? Just to let you guys know where we're at. Massive oil crisis lead to the Ford Mustang II. That's pretty hard on everybody. Then you've got Nixon resigning and the absolute lack of trust in America's executive branch and the federal government at large. Oh my God. And then we leave Vietnam and it falls to South Vietnam falls to the north. And then you've got blackouts in major cities, rivers on fire. And to add to it all, you've got disco, which I haven't brought up yet, but I want you to know that's the theme music to this slide right here. And people start to think, who did this to us? And here you have where you begin to see the birth of the modern conservative movement. Who did this to us? Why are we falling? This is why it's important to grasp history. If you don't know the actual reason that things were so good, you'll never be able to understand when they stopped being that good. So the moral majority shows up. The evangelical movement, they say we've lost our way morally. You've got neoconservative economics, which is, the idea that too much government is impeding the economy. It's the government's fault. You've got other people who, different strains of thought. They converge into this modern conservative movement. And the key of it is, what's wrong? Well, that would be a good question if it weren't for whose fault is it? And that's been a really big key of the way our politics has worked. Until somebody actually opens their eyes and goes, it's dead, I don't know that we're going to actually get good solutions. Anybody here feel like there's any good solutions on the floor right now for the immigration crisis? Anybody feel like there's any good solutions on the floor right now? Yeah, for the economy? You wonder why it's just a bunch of people like blaming each other for things? Maybe if you actually took the time to figure out why things were good, maybe you'd be able to move on and go, you know what? We can't look backwards anymore. Just my thought.